Asleep amidst the trees, bats all the swaying in the breeze, but one soul lies anxious, wide awake, fearing all manner of ghouls, hags, and wraiths. For your dolly sleep has flown, don't dare let her tremble.
Hey everyone, this is Hadley Thorne, and I would like to welcome you to Weird Realities Inc., where James Irby and I are meeting and speaking with some of the world's most interesting authors, podcasters, and filmmakers about their research into paranormal phenomena, ancient civilizations, myth, folklore, and their own weird experiences. James, can you tell us a little bit about today's guest?
So today we're going to get to learn more about author, paranormal investigator, and consciousness researcher Chaz, and we're going to talk about his book, which I say is a killer title, man. So good. It's Friendship, a story of UFOs, Nazis, psychedelics, and the expedition to the edge of the world. How you doing today, Chaz?
Very good. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, man. So the title of the book, I think, is awesome, man. It drags you right in. That's a whole lot getting thrown at you that I think a lot of people are interested in. So let's start off with that, man. Let's talk about some of the stuff with your book.
Yeah, of course. So the book Paranormal Expeditions: Hunt for the Friendship. It's available on Amazon. Check it out, guys. And it's my research into this UFO legend in South America that really hasn't gotten any kind of coverage in the English-speaking paranormal world. And when I first came across it, I was fascinated. And I just had to go down there and research it myself. And I spent several months in Chile, in Patagonia, looking into this UFO legend. And it took me to some weird places and some weird theories that I really never thought I would look at, but that's how the paranormal works.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and there's so much, that's kind of me and Hadley were talking too, just about the Nazi topic in general. That's just a core one that a lot of people think, after the war, like that's it, the Nazis were done and they were gone. But there's very real evidence that no, they were in South America. There's entire towns of German people. There's culture there. So just that alone, I think is fascinating. That all that came out. But then yeah, I guess a lot of scientific experimentation and stuff kept up. And
yeah. So to start with the Nazi kind of theory, well, let me first break down the friendship, this group. So this is a group in Patagonia. They've interacted with the local people around this area in southern Chile, and sometimes Argentina as well. And they're this group of tall, blonde people. They're humanoid in appearance. And they claim to be extraterrestrials. They say that they're from the, quote, center of the universe, and that they're here to, help raise our consciousness. But when I looked at this group and I observed their interactions, it became pretty obvious that they are not this benevolent group of aliens, that they're more human than anything else, that they have these interactions, some of them positive, and then some of them negative. Some people who interact with them, they receive great wealth. Some people get beat up and robbed. And it was this kind of group that they were really saying that they were aliens. So I looked into these I looked into all of the possible explanations. I looked into whether they could be aliens, whether they could be, something in between, and whether they could just be flat out human beings, and through that explanation, I definitely searched the Nazi angle quite in depth. And when I was in Chile, I uncovered some very interesting Nazi connections. There were quite a few groups and people who were very alive and well and operating in that area that were former Nazis. in Santiago, I went to the grave of one of these Nazis, and he was responsible. He was an SS officer, and he was responsible for the mobile gas chamber. He invented a mobile gas chamber, and the UN determined that he was responsible for, I believe, 800,000 deaths.
Wow.
Yes, and he lived his entire life out in Chile. He lived and died in Chile after the war. He was never extradited. He never faced a trial or a case against this this accusation. And he died a free man in Chile. And I went on further in my research to discover a group called Villa Bavaria. And they were formerly Colonia Dignidad, and it was run by Paul Schaefer, who was a Nazi. He was a Nazi medic and a famous child molester. And he started this death cult in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Andes Mountains. And he ran it for several years. It was used by the Chilean government as a clandestine prison. They would send prisoners there and they would disappear. No one would ever hear from them again. It became a thing. They would say, send them to the Germans. And they would send them to this compound in the middle of nowhere, and they would vanish. So these are all things I explore in the book. I physically traveled to Villa Bavaria and did some investigation while I was there. It's a very eerie place. It's as advertised. It's kind of disturbing. It's kind of spooky. They had. Go ahead.
So I had, I had a great uncle that was engineering stuff. And, it's kind of when I heard about it, I was still a child and didn't really, put two and two together. And then later on kind of, looked into it, but he went down to South America to basically clear land and build some stuff and all that. It brought him as an engineer. And he came back within like 2 months, and he's like, he couldn't do it. He said, some of the things going on down there were very just odd and different. And he kind of said that, they're building like a mini Germany in the middle of South America. And then later on you hear about like, Villa Bavaria and stuff like that. And it's crazy. It's so insane.
Yeah, I definitely, in this research, that was one aspect that it's kind of exploded in a way that I didn't really expect it to. Just so many Nazi stories and U-boats, these submarines that would wash up on shore and drop people off. And there's a town in Argentina close to the Chilean border, and the people of this town, they flat out believe that Adolf Hitler used to live there. They say after the war that Hitler came here. He lived in this house that you could only get to via boat because it was on this lake. And that's every 420 on his birthday, this house would throw elaborate parties and people would go there. And it was a very interesting kind of story. And it was just one of hundreds that I came across in this research. And I put a good portion of that into the book. And it's very bizarre that we're starting on this subject because my recent research has really kind of lined up with this kind of Nazi theory and this human UFO explanation.
Yeah. So in that, because recently I've looking more into the paranormal, especially, and myself kind of looking more at UFO phenomenon and stuff like that, because it's something that 70s 80s kind of had a build up, and then it's almost like this giant crescendo of the 90s of all those UFO phenomenon sightings, abductions and stuff, and then 2000s kind of hit, and now you just don't hear about it as often in a world where like media is connected so much, but it still happens a lot. Mm-hmm. And in looking at all that, I didn't know that there was a lot of belief that the Nazis had, technology, UFO technology and stuff during the war. And that's a lot of their scientific advances. A lot of people kind of believe that. And that theory is kind of picking up steam, it seems like, too. So.
Yeah, so that Nazi theory really stems from one project that is known, worldwide as the Nazi Bell. And what this bell-shaped device was actually doing is a subject that's for debate. There are historians very much debating about what it was to this day. All we know is that it was some kind of top secret project, and it involved a bell-shaped device. Now, the kind of accepted explanation is that this device was a centrifuge for diluting nuclear compounds. It was part of a Nazi nuclear program. And of course, that kind of checks out, right? The United States created an atomic bomb not long after this using a similar kind of device. But other theories posit some very interesting other explanations for this device. There's a book out there. It's called Hunt for Zero Point. And you'll forgive me because I'm forgetting the author's name, but he's a good researcher. And he suggests that this Nazi bell was some kind of anti-gravity device. And this has kind of been an idea that's out there for a while. And it's kind of an idea that I initially was kind of, I don't really know about. But recently I've come across some evidence that suggests it might be a little more accurate than I first believed. But there's the idea that the Nazis did have this kind of anti-gravity craft, these UFOs, and they were able to pilot them. And there's various theories. A lot of it stems from one Karl Donitz, who was an admiral, a Nazi admiral of the U-boats. And during his Nuremberg trial, he said that somewhere in the world was a secret Nazi fortress that was a paradise on earth. And that it was impenetrable to the Allies. And he said this, and a lot of people consider this to be Antarctica, the Antarctic Nazi base, which I'm sure you guys have come across before.
Yes.
It's a very popular theory. Through my research, I posit that perhaps it was in Patagonia, that perhaps this Nazi base was in southern South America. Which definitely lines up with a paradise on Earth, more compared to the Antarctic explanation.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a beautiful place when you're there, and it does look like the fjords of Sweden and Finland. It looks like northern Germany. It's really similar to that kind of landscaping. So there's one of every kind of Nick Cook. Thank you. Someone pointed it out. Hunt for Zero Point. Nick Cook, great researcher. Check him out. But the idea that this Nazi base may have been in Chilean Patagonia, and it may be the source of this friendship legend, is definitely an aspect that I put a lot of time into researching and to looking into.
I can't wait to see what you find out.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, well, I would love to prove that it was Nazis flat out, but as you go through the book, it becomes pretty obvious that there's not really one explanation that really fits all of it. I kind of, at the end of my book, come to a conclusion about folklore and how it evolves through time, but it doesn't quite explain some of the other aspects of this phenomenon. It's still very much a mystery. I would love to say that it all gets solved in the book, but that's just not accurate. It's a case that I want to bring to the world. I want other investigators to spend their time to go down there and look into it, because that's how I think we reach these answers. We're sitting on a Roswell level case. This is a huge. Hundreds of people have had interactions with this extraterrestrial group, and the fact that there isn't any knowledge about it in the English-speaking world is, for me, one of the biggest reasons I had to bring this case to the forefront.
Yeah, no doubt, and you're absolutely right. I've heard a lot. Speculation about stuff, the Nazis in South America and stuff like that. But yeah, until looking in your stuff, I'd never heard of the friendship group, which, is a giant rabbit hole. I'm like, oh, wow. And, it just kind of blows my mind that it's something that hadn't been talked about more. Again, especially in today's age where, you pick up your phone and look at anything.
Well,
Right.
Chaz, how did you find out about the friendship ETs?
So I believe I first heard it as like a kind of a brief mention in a podcast. Someone kind of had wrote, talked about it briefly. There's actually a case in Italy as well where a group claimed that they were also the friendship. Though through my research, I do believe they're separate groups. But what really kind of stuck out to me, what made me want to investigate this case, was actually a kind of personal synchronicity. And while looking into this kind of this friendship group, I heard about it and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I can't believe I haven't heard about it before." So I started doing research and looking into it. And one of the few things I found was a newspaper advertisement. And this was put in the private section of a newspaper in Patagonia in Chile. And it said, I'm not quoting exactly, something to the effect of, "I am the professional engineer who you visited in Sarasota, Florida 2 years ago. I did not know who you were, but I know now, and I would like to visit your island. Thank you." And it was this kind of weird message to the friendship group. And the reason it stuck out to me is because I'm from Sarasota, Florida. This is, my hometown. So for whatever reason, it kind of made the experience real. You hear about Roswell and you hear about all these kind of crazy stories around the world, but the fact that someone in my hometown has supposedly met this group, interacted with this group, and then went all the way down to South America to put this private advertisement in the newspaper, kind of, for me, that was kind of a validation that this is something that's actually occurring. It's real enough that people are spending their money and their time trying to get in contact with this group. And I said, well, why not me?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So good. So in the title, talk about a little bit about psychedelics. So let's get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my favorite aspect of my research. It's also my most controversial aspect of my research. So here's what you won't find in my research. You won't find any EVPs. You won't find any orbs. You won't find any of that traditional ghost hunter kind of content. Instead, I go for it. I go all the way. And what I mean by that is I conduct what was once considered shamanism in the Americas. And now it's considered, craziness. But I do psychedelic experiments to try to create or visualize or get into the right space to interact with these entities. And the reason I started doing this was because of a pretty bizarre experiment I conducted years ago. And this experiment involved a Ouija board and some magic mushrooms. So over the course of, I believe it was about 2 months, every weekend I would take these mushroom teas. I would brew a special blend of herbs and magic mushrooms into a tea, and I would take it and I would do seances on my Ouija board. And maybe for some of your listeners and for a lot of people in the paranormal community as a whole, that's a big no-no. There's a lot of people who have dismissed my research entirely because of this experiment. They say, "Oh, you're possessed by demons, that this is crazy, you're insane," those kinds of things. And I think that's maybe true to a degree. But when I did these seances, I'll be flat honest with you, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. I took heavy doses of psychedelics. I would sit there for hours trying to get communication with spirits, with anything through the Ouija board, and nothing occurred. Yeah. That was until a few weeks later, in between these experiments. So when I wasn't on heavy doses of psychedelics, I started seeing some bizarre things. And it wasn't poltergeist activity, it wasn't ghosts or anything, apparitions, it was UFOs. The first experience, I was preparing one of these mushroom teas, and I was just beginning to sip on it. And usually mushrooms, for those who are experienced, know, take about an hour or so to kick in. I had just began sipping this mushroom tea when I saw a strange object in the sky. And it suddenly burst into several smaller objects that scattered out into two different directions. It was something completely unreal. It kind of looked like, in the movies when a object is re-entering and it explodes, when a spaceship explodes in the atmosphere, it kind of looked like that.
Yeah.
And being in Florida, that's not impossible. We have lots of space programs and
right
re-entries and things, but I couldn't find anything that would confirm what I was seeing. There was no confirmation on any level. No articles, no news sites that said, yeah, there was a re-entry at that time. So that was kind of the first kind of, that's weird. A little later on, this was completely in between two experiments. I was the Wednesday of the week, and I was only doing these experiments on the weekends. I was hanging out with a friend. We were smoking a joint, so whatever, take that as you will.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some skeptics out there that will dismiss the story because we were smoking a joint. Those skeptics have never smoked a joint.
Right.
We were out there smoking a joint. My close friend about this research. And he was like, okay, well, that's kind of crazy. I told him about the UFO and he was like, yeah, sure, whatever. And as we were discussing this, we began to hear this metallic hum, this kind of off into the distance. And we look, and above the trees, we can kind of see the lights. And one of us says, well, hey, maybe that's the UFOs, something along that lines.
Yeah.
And we kind of laugh it off. But this hum gets louder. And sure enough, this triangle-shaped craft just hovers over my house. And the two of us were looking up and we're staring at it. It has a light in each corner. It's very clearly a triangle. It's kind of hovering in a fashion that, a plane certainly doesn't do. And it was so close to the ground that I could have, baseball if I was standing outside, with
wow.
On the street. It was that close. And it kind of just hovered for a minute and then continued on, flew past the house. And for me, that was because we were talking about it, because that was exactly what we were talking about when it occurred. It was this weird kind of acknowledgement from the phenomenon towards me. They were like, yeah, you're onto something. It was kind of that moment, whether or not it was intentional, whether or not they wanted me to see it. Something about this conversation and my intentions and possibly the psychedelics in my system allowed me to witness this craft, and for my friend to witness it. And funnily enough, I talked to him a few days ago, and I was with a group of people. And of course, this is a story I tell very often. And the group of people, they were like, okay, you were the other person there. Is this story true? And he said, well, we definitely saw something weird. He said, I don't know if I'm going to say it was aliens or anything like that. He said he personally thought it was some kind of military craft or something, but we definitely, he confirmed that, it's been however many years later, and he confirmed that he saw a weird triangle-shaped craft.
Yeah.
And it was a weird moment for both of us.
Well, Chaz, first off, let me say that I study shamanism, so I'm really fascinated by all this. And I just wondered if you felt like by opening your mind up using the mushrooms, if that kind of put you on a level that got you on the attention of these things that are flying around your house now. Are they watching you now?
Well, so I'm not quite sure that they're still here. I've had some weird interactions, but nothing consistent enough to say that, you know, that the house is haunted or anything like that. But through my research and my experiments, it seems that the best scenario to interact with these things is actually not when you're on a heavy dose of psychedelics. It's on the few days after that. For whatever reason, it seems like having the microdose level of whether it's psilocybin or diethyltryptamine, whatever drug it is, having a trace amount in your system seems to help facilitate these interactions. And whether that is seeing a craft, seeing a Bigfoot, or seeing your typical ghost apparition. It seems like these altered states of consciousness all play into these phenomenon.
I think, you know, it's because, yeah, that's something that you know, I've looked at recently and talking with other people and kind of looked at the research that, and there's not a lot out there, but you know, you look at stuff like ayahuasca or, you know, DMT especially, you know, there's a lot of people that do DMT and have shared experiences not doing it together, you know, but they talk about experiencing the same things, some of the same phenomenon. And then, you know, in some of the older stuff with ayahuasca and mushrooms and stuff like that, you have these cultures that painted pictures of things and describe things that, you know, seem extraterrestrial, foreign to us. And you know, I believe there's a lot more there that people realize. And I think a lot of times they just assume when you say psychedelics, you know, they think of this, you know, these, you know, raging 70s, you know, Grateful Dead concerts and stuff, but it's not, you know, it's especially with a lot of people nowadays doing DMT and the benefits of, you know, people that have post-traumatic stress syndrome and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping in the future, maybe a lot of that stuff will open up and maybe we realize, because I do think there's a part of your consciousness or something that's unlocked through doing that. And it's interesting hearing you talk about that because more and more people are saying that, you know.
Well, and I'll say this: I've never used psychedelics to do my journeying with shamanism. We use a drum. I mean, my shaman drums, and I journey with her, and we see the same things. But different things work for different people, and I'm a huge advocate for people exploring in a safe way what works for them, because there is so much out there that we're taught doesn't exist, or you're crazy, or this or that, and it's just not true. And it's like you said, it's altered consciousness. It's a different state, but they're starting to use the medicinal mushrooms in mental health treatments. There's a huge advocacy right now for this sort of thing. So I'm all for it, Chaz. Tell me more.
So yeah, they absolutely are a transformative experience. I especially approve of magic mushrooms, and that's because, to be honest, with how things are currently, you can never really trust a tab of LSD, and that's a guy who's taken a few of them. So, you know, to have the natural sources to do your mushrooms and your ayahuasca, it's absolutely it's a way you can, if you have any doubts or any, you know, thing like that when it comes to the existence of entities and otherworldly effects and powers, you can have those dismissed by taking a dose of mushrooms or DMT or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you pretty clearly, you know, figure out, especially if you do repeated trials, that, you know, there's something going on. There's a tangible reality bend that occurs. And through my research, I posit that UFOs in particular are certainly, they're physical crafts. They're something that exists physically, right? We can see that on camera footage. You can see the Navy videos. There's something that's physically there. But what occurs when you witness these physical crafts is a psychedelic side effect. When you watch this craft that bends space and time, the only way a human mind can perceive a bend in space and time is through those psychedelic effects. And people who are familiar with psychedelics will know what I'm talking about. You can take a dose of psychedelics, and alterations is one of the most common things. You take this dose and you feel like you've been gone for a year, and you come back and it's been 15 minutes. That's a common effect on DMT and salvia divinorum, another drug that gives that effect. The opposite effect occurs on mushrooms and LSD often, where you were doing something for like 3-4 hours and you thought it was only 10 minutes. It's this time dilation. There's the space dilation that also occurs. This is common on mushrooms. This is kind of the Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where I've experienced this myself, where you feel like you're shrinking down into a microscopic person. And, I watched my hand minimize into this weird, micro version. And again, it's all effects of the psychedelics. Well, when you look into UFO phenomena, and these people who have been close to or aboard UFOs, they're describing the same things. They're describing the exact same things that occur on psychedelics. They're describing time dilation, space dilation. They're seeing these strange, distant worlds. A lot of the time they're told it's Venus or Mars, those kinds of things. They see weird entities and they interact. And it's this crazy story that doesn't really make sense until you consider the fact that perhaps these people were under some kind of psychedelic influence. And I think being around these craft and even just seeing one of these craft can have an effect that is essentially psychedelic. It puts you in this kind of headspace. And oddly enough, through my more recent research, I've come across a Russian scientist who has said the same thing. His name is Viktor Gerbinikov, and he died in 2001. But he said, and this is crazy, but he said that UFOs were based on the exoskeleton of insects, and that when you try to view them and see these craft that use this technology, you only see light balls and discs, and it's this whole reality bending effect. But his research lined up in a strange way, almost exactly with mine. He says that UFOs come from insects, but he says the effects of seeing a UFO is exactly the same as what I posited. So there's some interesting ideas out there in this kind of realm.
Well, and in that vein too, when you talk to people or listen to interviews, especially who experience UFO phenomenon, their total demeanor changes, and you can tell, and it's almost as if for a lot of people it is, their world is opened up. It's the world's such a small place, and something like that really makes you question things. But I think there definitely something there, because you hear, especially with the more recent stuff with the military people talking about it, and the Tic Tac and everything, their whole demeanor changes and how they talk about things just change. I find that all just fascinating. And I'm a huge advocate for DMT. I think, again, people mistake or have an odd view of it and think of it as, uneducated people think like, oh, well, it's like meth or heroin and stuff, and it's not. And once you do something like that, your perception changes, and I could totally see the connection, with things opening up to you, especially in that realm, in that vein. So I find that super fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely when you talk about UFOs and you talk about ayahuasca trips, you can see parallels. It's something that occurs, and that kind of serious nature that comes with it. Like, oh no, this is something legitimate. Like, I saw this and this happened. It's kind of the same effect that occurs on both of those. Like, it's this serious nature. And I do want to put a caveat on all of this, that the research done on psychedelics absolutely has to be done with an extreme skepticism, and that's how I like to put it. You know, I think if you take a heavy dose of psychedelics, so no matter what that psychedelic is, you can interact with entities. Now, whether that entity is something you want to be interacting with is completely independent. You know, there's a lot of these people who have, you know, these transformation experiences under ayahuasca and DMT and whatever. But it's, you know, trusting these entities. There's actually in Peru, there's a famous case called the ayahuasca murders, about a guy who basically just lost his mind after doing too many of these things, and he killed a shaman in this village, and then he was killed by the villagers. It's a brutal story. There's videos and things on the internet about it, but it's these entities need to be treated with extreme skepticism. You know, there is this idea that especially DMT, that you're talking to the machine elves and these things. And I do believe these entities exist, but I try to put it in a way where people can understand that these entities, they should be at work. You know, they should be doing something other than talking to humans. Like, their job is not to be talking to humans. So the ones who are interacting with you are, they deserve this kind of skepticism. You hear the word often, especially in paranormal research and occult research, of the trickster. And, you know, this kind of low-key type, you know, entity that messes with people. And I do honestly believe that any of the entities you are communicating with through psychedelics, they should be treated like this entity. They should be treated like a trickster until you have any, you know, some kind of reason not to. And it's been through my experience that these entities, and through my research, these entities do have access to information. They do have access to some kind of, you know, paranormal energies and powers, but they are not truthful. They don't tell the truth most of the time. And this is something that can be found again and again in all kinds of literature and research, that these entities are not necessarily malicious, but they don't really care what happens to a human. And long ago I read an analogy. It would, in this kind of, I think, ways, carry some weight, and it was the idea that if you saw a bunch of ants in a circle and they were chanting your name, you would probably go over and check it out, right? So you go over and check it out, and you'd be like, okay, well, what do you want, ants? And maybe they say, you know, we would like water for the anthill. So you take a glass of water, you pour it on the anthill, and the anthill gets flooded and all the ants die. And you're just like, whatever. You know, like, it happens, ants, who cares? And I think this is kind of a perfect analogy of how these entities interact with us. And I'm waiting for the chance where they prove me wrong, where an entity, you know, is truthful, but I don't think so. You know, it doesn't happen that often. You can go, you know, throughout history and find people who say the world's ending tomorrow. You know, they're like, this is the apocalypse. I was told by the angels. I was told by God. I was told by this or that or this. Tomorrow's the end of the world. And it hasn't happened yet. So it's one of these things where these entities, they are real. Now, to the nature of the reality, I don't know what it is. And we shouldn't deify them. We shouldn't think that they're angels or demons. You know, we shouldn't think that they're good or bad. We should just acknowledge that they're real and they have some kind of interaction with us.
Well, there's two good points there. You know, you said something, you know, meeting everything with skepticism, like, you know, and I 100% agree. Like, even in the scientific world, when dealing with definites, they even like, well, you have to have somebody come along and prove you wrong or prove you right. You know, everything should be met with skepticism. but leave the ability there to believe too. And the other side of that, I think I've heard somebody explain, the when you open your consciousness, or you talk about, an alternate reality, or however people want to verbalize it, especially when dealing with ayahuasca and stuff like that, is, you're opening a hall of doors. Whatever door you open is yours. You don't know what's going to be behind that door, and it might not be the same door every time. So that's really interesting.
Well, that's one reason when we're doing our shamanic journeys, we set our intention and are very clear about who we want to interact with. And that way the entities that we are experiencing have our highest good lined up with that intention. And it also sets the boundaries to keep the others, the mischievous ones and the ones that are tricksterish, outside of those boundaries. So, and I'm just saying that for people who are listening, just to, kind of set your boundaries.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. Before I ever conduct any of these experiments, I do at least 30 minutes to an hour of meditation.
Yeah.
You don't want to carry anything that you don't want to have into these kind of experiences, because it's a difficult thing to do, to get to the point where I'm able to use these substances for paranormal research. It definitely took me a while, because when you take some of these mushrooms and things, you just blast off, and it's really hard to stay focused and to do a seance and to take notes and to record your EVP sessions and those kinds of things. But it's worth it. I think this is the avenue of research that so far paranormal researchers have been kind of shying away from. Like, this is where they kind of draw a line, and I understand that. I've met a couple roadblocks in this kind of research. There's other groups who I'd love to work with and share information with and work on projects together, but they just won't accept my research investigation for legal reasons, and I get that. And putting this stuff out there is kind of a risk to myself in a way, but not that many people are reading it. So I'm not too worried about it. But I think it's kind of this missing link where, paranormal investigation has been occurring for a long time, in this modern form since the 1800s, since spiritualism. And it's always, and it still is for me, about the pursuit of evidence. I don't want to talk to an entity. I only want to talk to that entity if he can, manifest something physically. Because they're doing this kind of research, there's no value in me talking to these entities, because I'm on psychedelic substances. There's, all of my research can be dismissed from that until I have a physical piece of evidence. Until I said, I went into this trip, I talked to this entity, and he gave me a magical, rock or whatever it is, and I can bring that. Yeah, and I can bring that piece of evidence, back from this experience. What I am sure about is using these substances does help facilitate these experiences, and whether that's paranormal experiences as a whole. The last experiment I did under psychedelics, I conducted another Ouija board seance, and it had been several years since I had tried this experiment, and I did it again. And nothing really occurred. And halfway through, I was like, all right, I'll take any sign. Give me any sign of entities and powers. And I'm on a pretty heavy dose of mushrooms. And oddly enough, my dog, he walks over and he has a rolled up note in his mouth. And I took the note out of his mouth and I unrolled it. And it was a note that my girlfriend had written the week before. And it was a note about how to get on. She was asking me a question about how to get on Instagram Live. But the note said, I'm trying to get on live with you. How do I do it? So it was this kind of weird synchronicity where I'm asking, hey, give me a sign. I want to talk to you. Give me any kind of sign. And my dog literally hands me a note that says, I'm trying to get on live with you. How do I do it? And it was this, weird experience. And under these, while doing these psychedelic experiments, those things happen, I would say, at least twice as often as doing it without the substances. And again, that's something that, it's a weird coincidence. I'm not really sure if I'm willing to call it, evidence of anything yet, because she wrote a note and she left it on a table and my dog picked it up. The timing is really the weird part about it. But it seems to dance between that kind of borderline, and when doing these experiments, it seems to get closer, at least, to physical reality. So that's why I'm kind of determined to see out this research.
Well, I'm really appreciative of people that present things that way, and you're straightforward with it. Like, here's the things I see, here's the things I find. I get it. My research might seem unconventional, but this is what I'm finding. Here's things for you to look at too, and opposed to coming up with the hard, definite, this is it, and I appreciate that avenue for sure. And with psychedelics and the things of that nature too, or spiritualism, anything, it's been going on for thousands of years. It's every culture had some form of mushroom or tea or something they would smoke, and it's been going on since since the Stone Age, as far as they can tell. So the fact that in a modern era things are kind of viewed as drugs viewed as like, oh no, you can't do that. Well, maybe there's something there that we've just forgotten about in a modern era. So that's
I do think I see it as a there's this common kind of explanation that comes from skeptics about any kind of paranormal phenomenon. Pick any of them, and they say, "Hey, it's a hallucination. They were hallucinating, whether it's because of carbon monoxide or limited oxygen. They find some kind of explanations to say that they were hallucinating."
Yeah.
And you know what? It's bizarre because in a lot of those cases, their explanation adds up, except when it hits the physical aspect.
Yeah.
A good explanation, a good example of this would be the Travis Walton case, fire.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Where he's gone for a week. This person is physically missing for 1 week. And he comes back and says, "Oh, I only thought I was gone for a few hours. I was on board this craft and I saw these weird worlds and these weird entities." And the way he describes it, if you read those initial descriptions, the way he describes it is like a person describing their first drug trip. It really is. But he was gone. Something physically happened to him. It's this situation where there were people there, they saw it happen to him, and he disappeared. You can find this kind of weird, bizarre influence in a lot of cases. Recently, I was working on the Kentucky Hopkinsville Goblins, and there's, from the witnesses, this description of this weird feeling that they got after the UFO flew over the house, and it all lines up with these kind of psychedelic experiences. And I think being that these craft are physical, they're physical on some level of reality. Now, whether or not humans understand that level of reality, up for debate, but there's something occurring physically. But when we experience it as human beings, our experience is mostly psychedelic. And that's why you get these weird stories of mantis beings and, these weird, irrational, kind of all over the place stories. And you get them from genuine sources, people who are like, yeah, this is what happened to me. There's cases where there's people with these implants, these strange pieces of metal and things that they can't explain. And when they're asked about, well, how did you get this? They say a crazy story about flying to Venus and seeing the mountains and blah, blah, blah. Well, none of that makes sense. We know Venus is a dead planet and all of that.
Yeah.
But they're sure that they experienced this. And when they describe the colors, you often hear it's realer than real. And this is, again, it's all these parallels to what happens when someone's on a psychedelic drug. And it's for whatever reason experiencing these craft, and I personally believe it's because these craft are independent of space and time. The only way for the human brain to really process that is the best it can. And what does that look like? That looks like a psychedelic experience, because that's your brain trying to process essentially poisons the best it can. It's trying to do this the best it can. And that's where I think there is an overlap. And I think by reversing the process, by putting yourself under these influences, you can see these craft reverse. If you see the craft, it puts you under the psychedelic experience. But if you're under a psychedelic experience, I think you're much more likely to be able to physically view this craft. Yeah. And this is something that's, suggested by a lot of researchers. There's Jacques Vallée, who has his whole psychedelic theory. There's Stephen Greer, who I think he's kind of a jerk, but he does these whole seminars where his whole thing is going out into the woods and meditating until you see a UFO. And again, that's putting yourself in that altered consciousness. It's doing essentially what I'm doing, except it takes a lot longer. I just eat a bunch of mushrooms and I'm there. I'm ready to see UFOs. It takes 3 hours.
And a good portion of that, I think, for some people too, is getting themselves in a state where they can accept it, because the mind, experiences trauma or shock oddly, and just being able to put yourself in a position where you are open to see things and understand it, and a willingness to see it, totally, I think makes things, easier for people. And you cited like the Travis Walton case, and people kind of, it was glorified through the movie and stuff, but there was a lot to lose through that. His brothers and friends were accused of murder because he was gone. And you look at the Betty and Barney Hill, one of the early abduction cases. A young interracial couple in the 50s, definitely didn't want to draw themselves attention to themselves, and then here they are, like, hey, we were abducted. So well,
you've got throughout history tales like of fairy rings and people disappearing and losing time, and I mean, it's there. And then one of the things I'm currently researching from my personal stuff is the Tuatha De Danann, and they came from outer space. They flew on ships in the air and came to Ireland, and they were tall, abnormally tall. They were blonde. They were fair haired. And you have this ongoing theme throughout history. And then I'll have to go back and say this, Chaz. I'm fascinated by you, and I think what you're doing is incredibly important, because basically what you're doing is you're taking 40,000 years of shamanism and using it in a modern way to investigate and explore these other alternate planes of existence. And I commend you and applaud your efforts.
No, absolutely.
I actually really appreciate you guys saying that, because that is how I kind of view this research, and it's good in that sense that I'm trying to revive it, but I also acknowledge that it's an attempt, because I do believe.
What you're doing is, you're breaking the ceiling, because nobody else is, or if they're doing it, they're not telling us. The shamans that I know are very closed-mouthed, and it's like, if you talk to them about it, they acknowledge that this is out there, but they're not really interested in exploring it, because that's what they do. And I
do think, especially here in the Americas and all around the world in different aspects and different cultures, but here in the Americas, there was a tradition, a shamanistic tradition, a psychedelic tradition that I equate to a science. Like they had it down to a level that we consider our modern science at. You know, it's mathematical, it's exact. You do this and this and this, and you get that. You know, that is how they used to operate, these shamans, and we've kind of lost that. You know, the colonists came in and the conquistadors came in and kind of wiped out these traditions. So I think it's vital that we do have the modern day shamans to kind of try to reconstruct what we've lost. And I'm very much aware that I love bringing these ideas and these things to the surface, but I'm also aware that I am kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. And I've gone into as much information about, you know, the traditional shamans and things that I possibly can, and even modern shamans. But that stuff does get a little iffy. The modern shamans, there's a lot of charlatans out there, so you got to be careful.
Yeah.
So,
well, do you think that's because as a Western society we don't trust psychedelics because of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s with like the CIA?
I think that has played a role, but I actually think as the Western society, we are in a better position than others to use these psychedelic kind of influences, because you kind of have these, you always have these breakdowns of occultism, left hand, right hand path, and all of that's kind of whatever. But if you take it from a purely cultural standpoint, you do have a breakdown of Eastern and Western occultism. And Eastern occultism is very much about meditation. It's about self-exploration. It's about doing it the right way through long practice and you know, focus and these kinds of things. And then you have the Western occultism, which is, you know, fuck it, let's take the mushrooms, let's take this. It's kind of I've heard it described as, and I don't necessarily like this word, but shortcuts. You know, you use these substances to take you to the meditative, this lucid kind of state. And you know, there's a lot of debate about which one's correct and which one's the better way to do it. All I know is that I was born into a Western background, and that, you know, a lot of this stuff, it works on your belief systems and your cultural, you know, where you are culturally. That's why there's people in Africa who can be killed by a curse, right? But if that same curse was put on you, you wouldn't die because you don't believe in it. It's these kind of, you know, what science calls the placebo and the nocebo, these kind of effects. And if you're into occultism and magic, you know that those effects are a huge portion of what you're studying. It's kind of mastering those effects. So as a person born and raised in the Western culture, I actually think it's ridiculous when people from, I personally know a guy, and he's not gonna hear this, so I'm gonna say it. I know this guy, he was from Sweden and he was a yogi, and he was absolutely insane. I've never met someone with more of a rage issue, and like he would snap. He would switch from peaceful yogi to psychopath in like a minute. And I really do think if you try to go out of your cultural, you know, your cultural world and reach over, there's this idea that no, you shouldn't do psychedelics. You should go sit in a cave and meditate for 40 years. And you know what? If you were born and raised in the culture where that was the path of enlightenment, then I think that would work. But for some American dude or Australian dude to go to Tibet, you know, buy all the robes and shave their heads and go do that, it's ridiculous. It's a thing that you're trying to get in touch to, but it's not really in your DNA. It's not really something that's you know, that you can try as hard as you want to get your mind around it culturally, but your parents weren't, you know, Tibetan monks. So it's just not really ever going to get to that level. So you know, whether I like to imagine possibly reincarnation is true, and that right now I'm incarnated in this, you know, American dude who has some crazy ideas. So I'm going to follow it all the way through. And maybe next time I'll be born as a Tibetan monk and I can try it that way. But this is the Western occult traditions. It's always been around. These substances, and going even back to fairies and fairy rings. Fairy rings are always made out of mushrooms. They're made out of these caps, these mushrooms, and it's kind of this metaphor where this is the gateway into seeing these entities. You step in the fairy ring, and it takes you to the fairy world. You consume the fairy ring, it does the same thing. It lets you interact with these entities, and I think that the Fae folk of Ireland and Europe and these ancient traditions are what we now call, UFOs and these things. I think the parallel between the two is very thin. I think it's possible that they're all separate, different things, but whatever facilitates our interaction with them, whatever lets us interact with them is the same thing. And that's whether it's Bigfoot, ghosts, or UFOs.
Whatever. Yeah. Well, I think everything requires a level of investment, right? Like, you look at people that exceed at sports or business or anything like that. Like, it's because they have this belief and have invested in that. And I think it's the same in the spiritual world or anything. You have to really invest in it to get out of it everything you want, or at least be open to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's something that you've got to come at. And this is a paradigm you can't really find a lot. And I think it's something that I provide. You've got to come out at it with an extremely open mind, but also an extremely skeptical mind. Yeah. And for most people, that's something they can't really entertain at the same time.
Yeah. Well, if you're not a skeptic, if you're not a skeptic, your journey's pretty easy, right? I believe in fairies 100%, and that's it. Your journey's over.
Exactly. And then every time you talk to an entity or interact with it, you're like, that was a fairy and it was great, and boom, that's exactly. It's this kind of confirmation bias that comes with it. And with my research, I luckily have a group of people behind me who are like, that's crazy, that will call me out and be like, keep me in check and say like that. I think you're going a little insane on that theory. And then when I come across theories and they're like, oh no, that's pretty weird, that's when I know I'm maybe on to something, having it double checked and peer reviewed. And that's a thing I've actually been coming across a lot lately in the paranormal community, is people who are not wanting their work peer reviewed, who are, keeping haunted locations secret and things like that. And that really, I think is counterproductive. Part of the reason I wrote this book about the friendship case is because it's something that people don't know about. And it's something that I want people to go and look into. I think by having people go there and look into it, it's a cumulative effort. It's not just, I'm not going to solve this case by going down there and taking LSD. I found some evidence. I found some really interesting things, and it's in that book if you really are interested. It's all the research you could have on the aliens, the Nazis, and the folklore of the area, and then it's my own personal experiments, and it's a huge volume of information. But it by no means is the last footnote on this case. I've had several people reach out to me and be like, where's the island? Where was the island that you were trying to investigate? And I give it away. If you want to know, hit me up on Instagram, on Twitter, ChazoftheDead.com, Chaz of the Dead on all the social medias. Sure, I'll share it with you because I want people to go there and I want people to check it out and see if they come across things that I came across. Any piece of information is valuable. And
Chaz, I got one question for you. Then let's let you pitch your book and tell us what you got going on. But what is the one thing that you have uncovered that changed your mind about everything you thought you knew up to that point?
You shouldn't have asked me that because now I gotta go on a whole. Talked about rabbit holes before we started the show. I've got a rabbit hole to go down. So I would say the first thing like that was the Ouija board experiments, because before that I had been paranormal investigating for about 6 or 7 years, and I had always considered ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoot to be separate phenomenon. until those experiments where, I was clearly trying to communicate with, ghosts or entities. And the phenomenon said, oh, okay, all right, you want ghosts? Here's a UFO. It was really kind of an eye-opening experience. The more recent thing that I've come across that's kind of stirred up my investigations is a very strange theory. And I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier. But 5 years ago, I was in Morocco and I met a strange man who told me this crazy story. And he said that he knew people who piloted UFOs and that UFOs were based on the thorax of honeybees. Right? Insane. Absolutely insane. So this guy did put forward some evidence to suggest that, at least his CIA connections were legitimate. Nothing to prove that bees were the source of UFOs, but there was some weird stuff that kind of made me think that perhaps he was, in intelligence like he claimed. Then a few months ago, I was doing a podcast and they had read that paragraph in my book. I put that little story in my book as a little digression. And he told me that was kind of an aha moment for him, because the host of this podcast said that he knew someone who lived in a military family and that his dad was this kind of man in black character, that he would work on these black projects and you could never really tell his family what it's about and those kinds of things. And when this son asked his dad on his deathbed, please tell me anything. Is there anything you can tell me about what you did, what you worked on? The only thing the father would say was, look at the bees. So that was a weird kind of connection. So now I have these two anecdotes about bees somehow being connected to the UFO phenomenon. So I did some digging. I found some modern scientific studies about how bees, they do operate independent of gravity. They have this economy mode where they're carrying things, but they use less energy. And scientists don't know how that's possible. And there's these weird mysteries about bees. And then I found a scientist named Viktor Gerbenikov, I mentioned earlier. And he's from Russia. And he says that he discovered anti-gravity chambers in the thorax of certain types of insects and the exoskeletons of certain types of insects. And that he was able to use this discovery to create a flying platform. And it's literally a square platform with handlebars. You can Google it. You can find Viktor Gerbenikov's flying platform. There's pictures of it. And he said that this platform was based off of this exoskeleton anti-gravity chamber, and that when he was flying around on this platform, that it would never create a shadow, and that when people that looked up and saw him flying around, they would only see either balls of light or flying discs. And those were his exact words. He said balls of light or flying discs. And he said operating this craft would also cause poltergeist activity. And anywhere that he landed it or flew over, it would cause these weird manifestations. He was an entomologist, so he studied insects. He said that he would take samples of insects in test tubes, and when he would fly back on his craft, during the flight, they would disappear out of the test tube.
Oh, wow.
Some of them would be adult insects, and then when he flew back and landed, they would be reverted into the larval stage. They became 2 weeks younger. And he had all of these effects that he talked about when flying the craft, and they all line up with the effects that I'm talking about, these psychedelic effects. So it was kind of this weird explanation that perhaps there is a human explanation to these UFOs. I've met at least, or I've heard at least 2 stories of CIA guys claiming that UFOs are based on insects. And then there's this Russian scientist who came across a similar theory that he's claiming that he built a UFO out of insects. So it's an interesting theory, and I'm planning to do quite a bit more research and looking into it.
Oh,
I
that's
can't wait,
fascinating.
man. Yeah. Yeah. So you made it super easy for everybody to find you. So your website, chazisdead.com, Twitter, Chaz is Dead, Instagram, Chaz is Dead, and YouTube, Chaz is Dead TV. So I think that's great. Anybody, you said you're pretty open for anybody reaching out. They want to talk to you. The book, like I said, killer title. I ordered on Amazon, just started into it. I dig your writing style. And definitely looking forward to future projects, man.
Yeah. If you guys enjoy my research, please buy the book. That's the best way to support it. It's Paranormal Expeditions: Hunt for the Friendship. It's available on Amazon. And of course, check out all the social medias and things too. If you guys want to talk about any crazy stuff, I'm always open.
Well, it has been a pleasure, and I hope that you will come back and visit with us sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually planning a couple experiments to test out this bee theory. I found some from the same scientist who says you can build these things at home to prove what he's talking about. So the plan is to build these things, film all of it, and put it out there. So
we'll definitely send it to us when you get it, and we'll share it across our media.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. This was a ton of fun.
Thanks, Chaz.
Well, guys, that's going to do it for today's show. On behalf of Weird Realities, I would like to invite you to join us each month as Gracie, James, and I discuss all things weird. We add new episodes a few times a month, so be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us so you can get alerts when we upload new content. Until next time, know that the team here at Weird Realities appreciate your support. Stay weird.
Keep it weird, guys. Bye.